How's it going, everybody? It's Steven, and today I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess you could say, a pet peeve of mine. Sounds a little maybe weird or negative, but hopefully I can kind of explain myself as the video goes on. So, I, like probably all of you, was very familiar with the story of the prodigal son growing up in church. You hear it a lot. It's in the Gospels, which is arguably the most popular section of the Bible, and it's one of the most popular parables in the popular books. So it gets talked about a lot. Um, and growing up, I always hated the story because uh, I guess I had a little bit of a pride problem, first off, but I also didn't really understand what was going on. And maybe some of you are also in the same boat that I was up until much more recently than I'd like to admit. Um, so what am I talking about, right? Got kind of a weird title. Um, there's one detail that I think really explains what's at the heart of what Jesus is actually saying and why it's actually really offensive to the people who are hearing it, but not for the reasons that we would think it is. And that question is, who is the older brother? Now, one thing that I'm trying to do with this channel is get people to start recognizing patterns and familiar themes in the Bible because as you're reading along, you're going to start to notice what seems like very similar stories, sort of motifs, character archetypes, right? Uh, Even places, right? They're going to keep getting repeated over and over again to the point where, it'd actually be kind of hard to miss. But most people aren't taught to look at it like this. You may not hear the Bible preached in this way, but something like the older brother is actually a very big theme, particularly in Genesis, right? That's where the title is coming from. What happens to the older brother in every single one of these stories? And it's not good, right? So, I guess just to back up, for anyone who isn't familiar with the prodigal son story, I'll just give a rough paraphrase. There's a father, right? Now, who's the father? That should be pretty self explanatory, right? He has two sons. The younger son says, I want my inheritance now. People who've studied this story, even kind of passingly, that's basically like telling your father, I wish you were dead. Because if you were dead, I could get this stuff right now. So it's deeply insulting. The father does it. The younger son goes off, raises all kinds of hell, gets so broke he's about to eat pig slop, and then he decides to go home and be a slave or a servant in his father's house. But the father's so overjoyed to see him, he decides to throw a feast, right? And we're going to come back to that too, because feast is another word that should get your mind going to certain places in the Bible. But the older brother, what's his deal, right? He is very angry. And he's basically telling the father, I've done all this work for you. I never left. You never celebrated me, and I've been here the whole time. And then the father says, my son, everything I have is yours, but this brother of yours was lost, and now he's found. And the story kind of ends on a cliffhanger, too, if you don't understand the motif, right? What happened to the older brother, right? Well, that's actually explained, hopefully, by what I'm about to get into, right? So, the older brother, if we just go to Genesis, right? Let's start listing. Cain murdered his brother in the field, right? So in the parable, the older son is actually out working in the field. That's where Cain murders Abel, right? Bad start. You have Ishmael, right? Abraham's son according to the flesh, as the Apostle Paul says. He persecutes Isaac, right? Who is the child of the promise. Then you have Esau and Jacob. Well, Esau is so disrespectful. He's such a flippant, foolish person. He trades his birthright away for a bowl of soup. And then we get to Reuben, who was actually Jacob's oldest son, but he loses his double inheritance, which he should have had, and it's given to Joseph. That's why Joseph's sons each get a tribe. Joseph kind of gets two, and there's not a tribe named after him, but Ephraim and Manasseh are both tribes, right? Well, Reuben got that deal because he decided to sleep with one of Jacob's concubines. Not his mother, but, one of Jacob's mistresses, basically. So right there, just in Genesis, we're running through this theme of the older brother, the firstborn son. They're all bad, every single one of them, and that is not an accident. God is trying to tell you something with this theme, right? By the way, Israel is referred to as God's firstborn son. If you've been paying attention, that ought to make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, because it is not a good thing to be the firstborn son when it comes to the biblical context. They all get disinherited, and they all do something pretty bad along the way, right? So with that theme in mind, if we've got this going in our head, when we see that there's an older brother and he's not named, right? Names are very important in the Bible, but sometimes when things aren't named, that may be even more important, right? Because it means it's a stand-in for that sort of archetype, right? The motif of the older brother, the younger brother, right? It's a stand-in for all these other stories, right? So the older brother in this story is Israel. And when you understand it in that way, all of a sudden the meaning starts to shift fairly dramatically, right? What Jesus is actually saying is, you, Israel, you are my firstborn son. Everything that I have is yours. But this funny thing happened back at the Tower of Babel, way before all this got started, before you were even a country, where all these younger brothers were disinherited. They were sent out. They went their own way. They started doing their own things, following other gods, and I'm calling them back too. And you're supposed to be happy about it. As a matter of fact, you're supposed to know that's what the point has been the whole time. You are supposed to gather the nations in and bring them to me, and you've been making such a mess of it. Not only are you not doing that, falling into the same sins and chasing after the same gods that all the neighboring nations are doing, you don't even have the decency to be happy when any of them repent. And so it's actually a very sharp rebuke. And the people who heard this story, I promise you, they understood exactly what Jesus was saying, and they were offended by it. We have permission to read that into the text, right? They were intimately familiar with all these stories, and they knew exactly what it meant. So, the older brother Israel is about to be cast out, right? Because, like I said, the story ends on a cliffhanger, right? Because the older brother is outside and he's not participating in the feast, right? Well, if I can pull it up real quickly, if we go to Matthew chapter 8, verses 10 to 12, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So there's a feast that somebody who you would expect to be there actually isn't. And by the time they may like to join, well, it's too late. And this is a prophetic prediction of the downfall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. It's all packed in there if you understand the layers beyond what is just being said on the page, right? This is how I'd like us all to start thinking a little bit more deeply, get these themes into our heads so that we're seeing what the text is saying and we can go beyond sort of the very surface level reading of it, right? Because I think if you understand it in this light, not only does the story make more sense, but, like for example, I would have had a much easier time accepting it when I was younger, even as a child or a teenager, if I understood the sort of deeper meaning behind it. Now, of course, the the message you usually get about how it's never too late to come back and God's always happy to run out there to meet you, that's all true, but there is something much deeper going on that actually, like I said, has a prophetic element to it. It's actually a great sort of apologetic resource because Jesus is predicting these events before they happen, and he'll do it directly in Matthew 22 when he starts his Olivet Discourse, but he's doing it indirectly now. These parables he's telling aren't accidents, and they have a much deeper, I don't want to say hidden, but you know what I mean, meaning than a lot of people may be aware of, even after multiple times reading it in some study resources. And speaking of Matthew 22, again, we have a feast, right? Jesus says, "Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy,'" right? The parable of the wedding feast, which is a different kind of feast than we're getting in the prodigal son. But again, feast, feast, feast. Getting this in our head. What happens? Well, the people who were supposed to come to the feast rejected. They're the older brother waiting outside and they won't come in. And so what happens to them? Well, Jesus says the king sends his armies out to destroy them. Is that what's going to happen in AD 70 when Rome surrounds Jerusalem? Yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen. And so hopefully I've kind of explained a deeper way to understand this parable, make it make a little more sense too, because a sort of surface level reading I don't think really does it justice because there are questions about what is wrong with the older brother. Doesn't he have a point? But what Jesus is actually saying is, no, you're the murderer, you're the adulterer, you're the guy who sells your birthright for soup, right? You're all these things. You persecute my legitimate children, right? And so now that we have all that in our head, we can sort of take a step back, get a much broader view, and then I think come to some much more interesting, deep solutions, sort of the meat versus the milk, to borrow from Paul, right? And that's basically all I had. It's like I said, it's been kind of a pet peeve of mine. Maybe you heard all of this before, you've grown up your whole life hearing it, but this is something that I haven't heard very often and took me longer than I'd care to admit to find out. So that's it. Thanks for checking it out.